Hello and welcome to the Birth Words Podcast, Episode 7. In this episode, we'll be talking about infertility.
You're listening to the Birth Words Podcast. Utah-based birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton digs into the language of pregnancy and birth to help expectant women claim their power as life-giving agents engaged in a praiseworthy work. This podcast aims to promote positive birth paradigms and is not intended as medical advice.
Welcome. I'm so thrilled to have you listening. I wanted to start out this episode by thanking a bunch of people that have made this podcast possible. Thank you to you, my listeners. Thank you to my mom, my birth giver, whose voice you hear at the beginning and end of each episode. Thank you to the Provo City Library and their basement creative studio, which makes recording possible, free, high quality, and awesome. Thank you to lynda.com and the podcast class created by Danny Osment, which showed me the ropes when I had no idea what I was doing when I got started on this adventure. Thank you to other local birth workers and non-local who have listened to my podcast, encouraged my work in this field, and most of all, thank you to my husband and my kids who hear a lot more about birth than they probably ever imagined that they would. So with that, I wanted to get started on a kind of difficult subject, infertility. One of my major concerns and worries about the work I do as a doula is that I talk so much about pregnancy and birth. And if I was in my own shoes about 7 years ago, if I'd come across any of the material that I produce regularly, it would have been very difficult for me to hear. I, like many others, struggled on more than one occasion with infertility. And I know that it's a difficult journey and a difficult path to walk and something we don't talk about a ton. And it's something I want to make sure that I am addressing in my work because it's important. So today, here I am talking about infertility. And let me briefly tell you a little bit about my two experiences with infertility. So my first pregnancy was twins. We tried for over a year to get pregnant and wasn't happening, so I went into my OB. They did some blood work, and the results of the test showed that I had high prolactin levels, which is the same hormone that makes mothers lactate, but having a high prolactin level that is separate from lactation can be apparently indicative of a tumor on the pituitary gland. So I had an MRI to make sure that I did not have a tumor on my pituitary gland. Everything looked normal. Everything in my husband's testing looked normal. So I was given the diagnosis of unexplained infertility, which was so frustrating because I like things to be explained. So I spent the next several years trying to explain my infertility myself. At the time of trying to conceive before I did conceive my twins, the doctors weren't able to give me an explanation of my infertility, but they were able to help me get pregnant. I was given Clomid, and on the second round of it, I was pregnant. And at 10 weeks, we found out not only was I pregnant, but it was twins, which is the quoted statistic is that about 5 to 8% of the time, a Clomid-induced pregnancy results in twins. I think I was at a little risk or opportunity for a higher rate of that happening because I was already having ovulatory cycles and my dosage was increased the second round. So those upped the odds. And I had twins, which was awesome in many ways and challenging in a few ways as well. So So after the twins' birth, after a while, we got to the point where we weren't necessarily ready to have another baby, but we were ready to just let whatever happen. And then nothing happened for a long time. And then we decided to start trying to have another baby. And nothing happened for over a year. And I saw the nurse practitioner in my OB's office a few times, and we tried a couple of things. My thyroid levels were just barely high for the zone that they like trying to conceive in pregnant women to be in, which is a little more narrow than just a typical normal healthy thyroid level zone. So I took thyroid medication for a little while. I am pretty sure I should remember these things, but I have 3 kids, so I don't remember everything these days. I'm pretty sure I took progesterone for a while and nothing happened. And my nurse practitioner at that point said, okay, we're not a fertility specialty office. The next step from here would be to refer you out to a fertility specialist, and they would probably start with HSG, which is hysterosalpingogram. Sorry to those of you who know how to pronounce that correctly the first time, which is basically where they fill your uterus with a solution that has iodine in it, which is a contrast dye that helps to see if there's any blockage, physical blockage in fallopian tubes or in the uterus to see if that was what was going on. We weren't ready to take that step, so we just were like, oh, well, we'll just see how things go for a while. And we got pregnant a little while later, after about 2 years of not trying to not have a baby. So those were different experiences, but I learned a lot from both of them. To anybody out there who's listening who has experienced any level of infertility, I don't have to tell you that it's frustrating, that it's exhausting, and that along the way you feel alternately hopeful and dejected on repeat. And it can be very isolating. So I want to take a look at the language surrounding infertility and see what role it plays. The main thing that comes to mind when I think about infertility and how it crosses over with the studying I've done in linguistics is about identity. Identity is a big part of applied linguistics, and different linguists have different ideas about how and whether identity is constructed or performed, but pretty much everyone agrees that it's an important topic. So Jan Blommaert, a Belgian sociolinguist, talks about identity as semiotic potential. And we talked in episode 2 and 4 a little bit about semiosis, a semiotic system. We talked about how language is a semiotic system, which means that signs are used to communicate meaning. And we talked about how language, words are just really signs that are used to communicate meaning. And in episode 4, I talked about discourse with a capital D and how language and words are only one of a variety of signs that are used to communicate meaning. Other signs that are used to communicate meaning are dress, accent, posture, and so forth. And so when we talk about identity in linguistics, we talk about how these different semiotic systems, these different sign systems that communicate meaning are used to signal an identity, to say, hey, this is who I am, this is who I affiliate with, this is maybe some tendencies that I might have, and we throw out these blinking lights, right? These signs as we go about our day by the way that we talk and dress and where we go and how we move that kind of communicate who we are or how we want to be perceived socially. So how does all this tie into infertility? Well, I've recently been reading a book called Unsung Lullabies by Janet Jaffe and Martha and David Diamond, and they are co-authors of this book, and they run a center for reproductive psychology, and they talk a lot about the psychological issues that come along with infertility. And as I was reading, I was thinking about the identity issues that come to play in an infertility situation. So I'm going to focus on 2 of the ways that identity and infertility intersect that they discussed in their book and that I've kind of thought about separately as well. So with infertility, you are compelled to interact in a different semiotic system than those who are able to conceive without assistance. So, in an unassisted conception, the signs that you experience and produce are very personal and intimate. The setting is private, your bedroom. The words exchanged are those between lovers and as pregnancy is realized. Often the communication starts as a secretive and excited anticipation, and it's overall a very personal and emotionally tied experience. With any kind of assisted reproductive technology, at whatever level it's used, you enter into a very different semiotic world. The way that meaning is construed in these settings is totally different than that intimate, private setting in an unassisted conception. And so whereas we may typically think of identity as something you perform or convey by choosing how you talk and walk and what you wear, in the case of infertility, a new identity is thrust upon you, and it's not one that you want. So Alistair Pennycook, he's a distinguished professor of applied linguistics at the University of Technology in Sydney, argues that it's always this way, that identity is not something you choose. He says, thus, while it is useful to view language and identity as interrelated acts, we should be cautious not to adopt a position which suggests they are acts that we freely choose. He says we're kind of put into situations that we're not necessarily always choosing the identity that we're given. And I may agree with that on some points. I may take issue with it in some circumstances, but I feel that it's true in the case of infertility that you are given an identity that doesn't sit right, that isn't who that it's not part of the plan. So by walking into the doors of a clinic, an infertility clinic, or just your obstetrician's office with that need specifically in mind, you take on the label of patient. Changing into a gown, undergoing further testing is further evidence of this identity as a patient. I felt this keenly when I had my MRI done, again, scanning to see if there was a pituitary gland tumor. It was so strange to me because I had had such a healthy childhood and adolescence. I had not really been a patient. I had colds and well checks at the doctor occasionally, but I had not really been a patient. And I remember going to my MRI and changing into the gown and going into this machine that is just claustrophobic and just crying that this was not who I was. I was a healthy, well individual, and what am I doing in this crazy machine? And it was scary. And I was not ready to accept that identity that was put upon me with the setting that I was put in and the equipment that was being used. And it was difficult. And then as you go forward with your infertility journey, whether it's needle pokes, shots, whatever other procedures you undergo, they're generally in stark contrast to that ideal conception in your mind and the signs and systems that operate in a private, personal, intimate setting versus a clinic with tests and procedures. And I think that's one of the reasons that infertility can be so challenging. Another that is pointed out again by Jaffe and Diamnod, the authors of Unsung lullabies, is this idea of a reproductive story. And they argue that from an early age, whether subconsciously or consciously, you've been forming a reproductive story. Sometimes kids play this out really consciously, and they play house and they say, when I grow up, I want to be a mommy or I want to be a daddy. Sometimes they do it less consciously and they play with little groups of trucks and say, this is the daddy truck and the mommy truck and the baby truck, and they're not associating it with themselves, but nevertheless, they're forming this identity as part of a reproductive story that they're telling. And so infertility is an interruption to that story. And Jaffe and Diamnod say, your reproductive story, whether in narrative form or as a series of wordless images, is a fundamental part of your sense of self, a cornerstone of your identity. It may only become a conscious story when you experience an obstacle to becoming a parent. Sometimes it's the pain you feel, the sense of disequilibrium when faced with reproductive difficulties, that brings your reproductive story into focus. And when I read that, having faced some bumps in my own reproductive story, it resonated. I know it can be difficult. My heart goes out to any of you listening who are experiencing infertility, and I hope this episode has shed some light on the struggle of infertility, and it gives those experiencing it some perspective and some hope to move forward with some sense of camaraderie. And I hope that listeners who know others struggling with infertility can be sensitively empathic to them and recognize that it's a challenge and it's a struggle, and if you're going through it, you are not alone. I am happy to be in contact if you're interested in talking more about it. Also, if you feel inclined to share a story about infertility and language, either as a guest or a pre-recorded story, or I could read a summarized version, reach out to me at my website, summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. I recognize that is a vulnerable place to put yourself, and only encourage that if that feels like something that would be healthy and good for you to do. Otherwise, I thank you for listening. Please see the show notes for the references that I referred to today, and I hope to join with all of you again next Monday. Thanks.
Did words play an important role in your birth experience? If you're interested in sharing your story on the podcast, go to summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If you're liking what you hear on the podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you choose to listen. For more resources about harnessing the power of words to benefit the birth experience, visit summitbirthutah.com/birthwords.